When I first walked into that courtroom, my hands were shaking. Though I tried my best to hide it, I could feel every heartbeat echoing in my chest like it wanted to remind me I was still alive. After all these years, the place smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. The walls were tall and quiet, as if they too were holding their breath. And when I looked toward the judge's bench, my eyes met his, and in that instant everything around me fell away. He froze, the judge, the same man who had once stood at the front of a small-town courtroom 25 years ago when I was a scared, broken girl on the other side of justice. He didn't recognize me at first. I could see the confusion flicker in his eyes, but when my name was announced, Sarah Thompson, his face changed like the past had suddenly come alive again. I wasn't there as a defendant this time. I was there as a witness for a young girl whose story was too painfully familiar. Her name was Kayla, just 16, frightened, alone, and accused of something she hadn't done. I had promised myself years ago that if I ever got the chance to stand up for someone like her, I would. I owed that much to the young girl. I used to be the girl who had walked out of that same courtroom decades ago with her head down and her spirit shattered. As I sat there waiting for my turn to testify, flashes of the past started flooding back: the smell of that same polished wood, the same solemn silence, the same man who had looked at me then not as a person but as a case number. I had been 19 back then, desperate, broke, and misunderstood. I had made mistakes, sure, but nothing that deserved what came after. I had grown up in a small southern town where gossip traveled faster than kindness. My father had left when I was 8. My mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. I was smart, though, always at the top of my class. Teachers said I could go far, but life has a way of testing dreams when you least expect it. When my mother got sick, everything changed. The hospital bills piled up faster than we could pay. I took odd jobs, cleaning houses, babysitting, anything, but it was never enough. One day, a so-called friend of mine offered me a way to make quick cash. She said it was just paperwork, something small and harmless. I was too naive to know it was part of a fraud scheme. The next thing I knew, the police were knocking at our door and I was being arrested. My mother stood there crying, begging them to listen to me, but no one cared. They said I was guilty. They said I was clever enough to forge documents and lie to the authorities. The trial was quick, cruel, and cold, and the man who sentenced me was sitting right in front of me now, Judge Robert Hensley. He had been young then, sharp, confident. His words had sliced through my world like a blade. When he said 5 years, I remember feeling my knees go weak. My mother had cried so loud the bailiff had to escort her out. I remember the judge wouldn't even look at me as I was taken away. Prison changed me, not in the way people expect. It broke something inside me, but it also planted a seed. I met women there who had stories like mine, women who had no one to speak for them. I began helping them write letters to their families, to the courts, to anyone who might listen. I discovered something I never knew I had: a voice. After my release, I worked hard to rebuild everything I had lost. It wasn't easy. No one wants to hire a woman with a record. I scrubbed floors, waited tables, lived in a one-room apartment with peeling paint, but slowly things began to change. A small nonprofit hired me to help with outreach for at-risk youth. They didn't care about my past. They cared about my heart. That's how my journey began. I started sharing my story at schools and community centers, telling young girls that one mistake doesn't define who they are. I built trust, I built hope, and little by little I built a new version of myself. So sitting there in that courtroom years later, watching young Kayla tremble before the same man who had once condemned me, I knew I had to be strong for her. I had to show her that the system might be harsh, but kindness could still win. I looked over at her and smiled softly, the kind of smile that says you're not alone. She nodded, wiping her tears, and I could see courage flicker in her eyes. When they called my name, I stood up, walked slowly to the stand, and raised my hand for the oath. My voice was steady, my palms warm. I told the truth, every word of it. I spoke about Kayla's character, her honesty, her struggle, and how easy it is for broken circumstances to turn good people into suspects. The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Then it happened. The judge looked at me closely, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to place my face. He cleared his throat and said, "Miss Thompson, have we met before?" His voice was quieter than I remembered. I paused, smiled faintly, and said, "Yes, Your Honor, many years ago in this very room." His eyes widened slightly, and I saw something I never thought I would see in him: remorse. The air shifted. The prosecutor looked confused. The defense attorney stared at me curiously. I continued speaking calmly. I said, "Years ago, I stood where Kayla stands now, and I lost everything. But today, I stand here not as that frightened girl I once was, but as someone who found purpose through pain, and I'm here to make sure no one else has to lose their future the way I did." You could hear a pin drop. The judge leaned back, his face pale. The silence felt heavy, like time itself had paused. Finally, he whispered, "I remember now. I remember your case, Sarah Thompson." His voice cracked just slightly, and then he said quietly, "I am sorry." For a moment the world felt still. I looked at him and said, "It's all right, Your Honor. You did what you thought was right back then, but people change, so do hearts. That's why we're here right now, to make things right when we can." That was the moment everything changed. After the hearing that day, I stepped outside the courthouse and took a long, deep breath. The air felt cooler than before. Maybe because the weight I had been carrying for 25 years had finally begun to lift. I stood there on those old courthouse steps, looking at the people rushing by, each of them lost in their own stories, and I thought to myself, maybe this is what peace feels like. Not loud, not perfect, just still. Kayla came running out behind me, tears streaming down her cheeks. She threw her arms around me and whispered, "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened without you." I hugged her back and told her, "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. Just promise me you'll keep believing in yourself no matter what happens." She nodded, and I could see a spark in her eyes that reminded me of my younger self before the world had taken its swing at me. That night, when I got home to my small apartment, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window watching the city lights blink in the dark. I had always loved nights like that, quiet, lonely but honest. I looked down at my reflection in the glass and whispered, "You did it, Sarah. You stood where you once fell, and this time you didn't break. But the truth is, healing doesn't end with forgiveness. It begins there." There were still nights when I woke up sweating, my heart racing, remembering the sound of the judge's gavel hitting the wood, remembering my mother's cry as they took me away. I still missed her every single day she had passed while I was serving my sentence, and I never got the chance to hold her hand one last time. That pain never really leaves you, it just softens around the edges. A few weeks after the trial, I got a letter in the mail. The envelope was official white with the courthouse seal on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten note from Judge Hensley himself. He wrote that after hearing my testimony and learning what I had done with my life, he had gone back to read my old case files. He admitted that he saw now how unfair the system had been to me. He said I taught him something that, ours on the bench had not, that justice without mercy is empty. I sat there holding that letter, and for the first time I cried, not from pain but from release. I decided I wouldn't keep that letter hidden. I framed it and hung it above my desk, not as a reminder of what was done to me, but as proof of how far grace can travel when we choose compassion over bitterness. In the months that followed, I got busier. The nonprofit I worked with offered me a new position, mentoring young women who had been through the criminal justice system. Many of them had no family, no one to guide them. I listened to their stories sometimes, holding their hands through tears and silence. I told them about hope, about how one mistake doesn't erase who you are, and how even the smallest step toward kindness can start a new chapter. One girl named Tasha stayed in my mind. She was 20, just out of prison, scared and angry at the world. She reminded me so much of myself that it hurt. At first, she didn't trust anyone, not even me. She kept saying, everyone always leaves, everyone always lies. One day I invited her for coffee, and we sat in a quiet corner of a little cafe downtown. I told her my story from start to finish, no pretending, no sugarcoating, just the truth. She didn't say much, just listened, But a week later, she showed up at my office asking if she could volunteer. I smiled and said, "I thought you'd never ask." That was how I knew the work I was doing mattered. Not because it erased my past, but because it gave purpose to the scars I carried. Life started to open up in small, gentle ways. I began teaching workshops on restorative justice. I traveled to schools and prisons across the state, telling people that second chances aren't charity, they're humanity. Somewhere along the way, people began calling me Miss Sarah, the lady who believed in broken wings. And then one afternoon, as I was speaking at a university event, I saw someone standing quietly at the back of the hall. It was Judge Hensley. He waited until after my speech before walking up to me. His face looked older, his eyes softer. He said, "Miss Thompson, you changed the way I see everything." I nodded and said, "We both changed, didn't we?" He smiled faintly and said, "Yes, we did." That was the moment I realized forgiveness doesn't just free the person who was wronged, it frees the one who did the wrong too. But what I didn't know was that my story was about to take another turn. Life was not done teaching me yet, because just when you think you've made peace with the past, it sometimes comes knocking again. But this time I was ready. 2 months passed quietly after the trial, and life settled into a soft, calm rhythm again. I kept working with the girls at the center every day, pouring myself into their stories, holding their fears like they were fragile glass and teaching them to turn the sharpest pieces into something worth keeping. I felt a kind of peace I had never known before, a peace that comes only after surviving things that were meant to break you. But peace rarely lasts forever. One Thursday afternoon, as I was finishing paperwork for the center, a knock came at my office door. I expected it to be one of the girls or a staff member. Instead, when I looked up, a man I did not recognize stepped inside. He looked nervous, his eyes shifting around the room like he was afraid to exist in the space. His clothes were worn, his hands trembling a little. I asked softly, "Can I help you, sir?" He took a deep breath and said, "You don't know me, but I knew you years ago." My heart tightened. I had heard words like that before, and they always carried ghosts behind them. I folded my hands and said, "It's all right. You can speak freely here." He sat down slowly, his shoulders hunched, like he was carrying years of regret. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "My name is Reed, Detective Reed." I froze. The name shot through me like lightning. He was the officer who had arrested me long ago, the officer who had put handcuffs around my wrists while my mother begged him to stop. He swallowed hard and continued, "I heard you speak on TV a few weeks ago talking about your past, and I knew I had to come find you." I leaned back in my chair, my heart beat loud in my ears. I wanted to run, I wanted to stay, I wanted to scream, but I sat still and listened. He said, "Sarah, I was young back then, too young and too proud and too desperate to keep my job. The department was under pressure. They told me to bring in someone for that case, any someone. And you were the easiest target. You were poor, you had no father, no connections, and everyone already believed you were trouble." He paused, his voice cracking. "I knew you didn't do it, Sarah. I knew it, but I signed the papers anyway." My hands shook, but I kept my voice calm. "Why are you here now?" He wiped his face like he was ashamed. "Because the truth has been eating me alive for 25 years, and seeing what you became. Seeing what you've done with your life, I couldn't live with myself any longer." He took out a small envelope and placed it on my desk. Inside were documents, statements, and a written confession. He said, "These are everything you need to clear your name completely. You deserve that." I stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. I felt a heavy ache in my chest, not anger, not even shock, just a deep, tired sorrow. A part of me had waited for this moment, but another part of me had already let go years ago. I whispered, "Why now, after all this time?" He looked at me with broken eyes. "Because my daughter is 16 now, and when I look at her, I see what I did to you, and it destroys me." The room grew quiet. The walls seemed to lean in, holding our pain between them. I closed my eyes, letting the silence settle before I whispered, "You hurt me, Reed. You hurt my mother, and you took years from me that I will never get back." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know, and I won't ask you to forgive me. I just want to take responsibility for what I did for once in my life." I breathed slowly, letting the weight of the past settle and shift inside me. Then I said something I never planned to say. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. It's choosing to live without letting what happened poison your heart. He stared at me. You forgive me. I shook my head gently. Not yet, but someday maybe, and that's enough for now. He stood quiet for a long moment, then nodded, and slowly walked out of my office, leaving the envelope on my desk. The moment the door closed, I felt my knees weaken. I sank into my chair and let the tears fall. Not angry tears, not bitter tears, but the kind that carry years of silence out of your soul. Later that evening, when the center closed, I took that envelope home. I sat in my small living room, opened it under the soft light of my table lamp, and read every page. Every word was a piece of the past, rising from the grave. I cried again. But something felt lighter, as if the truth had finally found me, after chasing me for half a lifetime. The next morning, I went to see Judge Hensley. He was surprised to see me. I handed him the envelope and said quietly, "This is the truth." You never had he read through the document slowly, his face hardening, then softening, then breaking. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Sarah, I failed you." I shook my head. "No, sir, the system failed both of us, but now we have the chance to do something good with the truth." He nodded, wiping his eyes. "You have my word I will make this right." The rest of the day passed in a blur, but that night when I sat outside on my porch with a cup of warm tea and the quiet company of the stars, I felt something I had never truly felt before: closure. Not perfect, not whole, but real. I whispered to the night, "You survived, Sarah. You really survived." And the story was only just beginning when the news finally came out that my name had been cleared. It did not happen quietly. It began as a small article in the local newspaper tucked into the corner of the justice section with the headline, "Woman wrongly convicted decades ago finally exonerated," but within days it spread across the state and then the count. My phone began to ring, endlessly reporters wanting interviews, old neighbors wanting to apologize, people who barely remembered me, wanting to say they always knew I was innocent. I smiled politely at each call, but my heart felt strange. I had dreamed about this moment for so long, yet now that it was real, I did not know how to feel. Freedom is a beautiful thing, but it can feel heavy when it comes too late. The nonprofit where I worked threw a small gathering for me that week. The girls brought flowers and cupcakes and made a sign that said, "Our Miss Sarah, the strongest woman we know." I laughed and hugged them all, but later that night, when I was alone, the laughter faded into quiet tears. I whispered to my reflection in the window, "You are free, Sarah, but you have been free for a long time. The papers only just caught up." A few days later, I was invited to speak on a national platform about justice reform. It was a big event, the kind where people wore suits and carried notebooks, ready to listen to facts, not feelings. But I stood there in my simple blue dress and told them my truth. I told them about being 19, scared and sentenced. I told them about the officer who finally came forward and the judge who chose to make amends. I told them about the girls who sit in cells right now, praying for someone to believe in them. I said freedom without compassion is only half a victory. The room went quiet, then everyone stood and clapped. But I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a messenger. After that event, my life changed again. I started getting letters from all over the country. Mothers, daughters, teachers, even police officers, they wrote to say, my story helped them see something new. One woman wrote, "My son is in prison, and I stopped visiting him out of shame. But after hearing you, I am going tomorrow." Another wrote, "I am a judge, and I promise to never forget the human heart behind every file I hold." Those letters became my treasures. I kept them in a wooden box beside Mia's journal, and sometimes on quiet nights I would read them aloud to remind myself that pain can grow into purpose if you let it. But not everyone was kind. Some people from my past resurfaced with gossip and judgment. A woman from my old town called me a liar on social media, saying I must have done something to deserve it anyway. I saw the post, and for a moment I felt the sting of those old whispers, But then I smiled softly because I had outgrown their noise years ago. Those words would have broken me, but now they could not even shake me. Then one afternoon I got a letter from the office of Judge Hensley. He wanted me to meet him one last time. I went to the courthouse with a calm heart. This time the courtroom did not feel intimidating. It felt familiar, like an old photograph of a place that once held pain but now held peace. He greeted me with a warm smile, his hair grayer than before, his eyes softer. He said, "Sarah, I am retiring next month, and before I do, I wanted to thank you again, not for forgiving me, but for showing me what justice truly means." He handed me a folder. Inside were copies of new policies he had helped pass for reviewing wrongful convictions. I looked at the papers and felt tears rising. He said, "I wanted you to see what your story started, Sarah. You turned a wound into a movement." I could not speak for a moment. My throat tightened, and all I managed to say was, "Thank you, not for me, but for them." He nodded quietly and said, "You changed more lives than you know." When I walked out of that courthouse for the last time, the sun was setting, the sky soft gold and pink. I stood on the steps where I had once been led away in chains and whispered to the air, "We made it, Mama." From that day forward, I decided to dedicate everything I had to the ones still fighting. I created a foundation in my mother's name. The Grace Thompson Initiative, to support women leaving incarceration and help them rebuild their lives. The first office was small, just 3 rooms and a handful of volunteers, but the energy inside it was pure hope. Every woman who walked through those doors carried a story, every one of them a battle, and I listened to each one as if it were my own. Sometimes I would visit prisons too, not as a victim, but as a guide. I would tell the women, "I see you, I know you, I am you," and their eyes would soften as if they finally believed someone meant it. It was during one of those visits that something unexpected happened. A guard approached me afterward and said, "There is someone here who wants to see you. She says she knows you from before." My heart skipped a beat. I followed him down a long corridor to a small interview room, and when I stepped inside, I froze. Sitting there on the other side of the glass was the last person I ever thought I would see again. It was my cousin Beth, the same cousin who had been the reason the false documents were signed, the one who had vanished when everything went wrong, the one I had thought was long gone. She looked older, her hair gray, her eyes hollow. I sat down slowly, and for a moment we just stared at each other through the glass, until she whispered, "I never meant for it to be you, Sarah. I swear I was scared. I was stupid. I never thought they would arrest you instead of me." I sat there silent, my hands trembling, memories flooding back of betrayal, fear, and years lost. She said softly, "I turned myself in last week. I could not live with it anymore. I saw you on the news. I saw everything you have done, and I knew I had to tell the truth." My heart broke and healed at the same time. I whispered, "Why now?" She said, "Because you forgave everyone else. I wanted to forgive myself too." For a long while we just sat there crying quietly, 2 broken women connected by blood and regret. I told her, "I don't hate you, Beth. I did once, but I don't anymore. You were lost like I was." And she looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and said, "Maybe we can both start over again." I left that prison with heavy steps but a light heart, because I knew I had just witnessed something rare, redemption. When I reached home that night, I opened Mia's journal again. The last line I had never noticed before said, "Even the darkest story can end in light if someone decides to love instead of hate." I closed the book and whispered, "Yes, Mia, you were right." And for the first time in my life, I truly felt free life. After that meeting with my cousin Beth felt different. Something inside me had finally rested. It was as if a weight I had carried on my shoulders for years had quietly slipped away. The world looked softer, the sky felt wider, and even the smallest things like morning sunlight on my kitchen window made me smile. I spent most of my days working with the women at the foundation. Every week we met new faces. Each woman carried her own kind of pain. Some had lost their families, some their confidence, some simply their belief that they deserved another chance. I would sit with them in the little counseling room and share coffee and stories. Sometimes we laughed, sometimes we cried, but every time we talked there was healing happening, even if they did not realize it yet. One afternoon, while sorting through donations, a young woman named Lila walked in. She looked about 20, and her eyes were tired, like she had seen too much too soon. She handed me a note that said, "I was told you could help me." I read it and nodded. We sat down together, and she began to talk about her past, the mistakes, the guilt, the shame. I listened quietly, and when she finished, I said softly, "Lila, you are not your past. You are what you decide to become now." That moment reminded me of the first time someone had said something kind to me after I got out of prison. It was such a simple sentence, but it had changed my entire direction. That was when I realized how powerful words could be, how healing compassion truly was. The foundation began to grow. We received small grants and then bigger ones. Volunteers came from colleges and community centers wanting to help. Some of the women who had graduated from our program came back to work with. As they said, "Miss Sarah, I want to be like you," I smiled and told them, "Be better than me. That is what I want." Around that time, a journalist named Michael came to do a follow-up interview. He had covered my case years earlier when the story first broke. He walked into the office one morning wearing a kind smile and said, "I wanted to see what you built, Sarah." I told him he was welcome to stay and observe for a day. He watched how the women interacted, how they laughed through pain, how they comforted one another. Later he told me quietly, "I have interviewed politicians and heroes, but none of them moved me the way you did." I chuckled and said, "I am no hero, Michael. I am just a woman who refused to stay broken." Over the next few weeks, he kept visiting for his article, and slowly our conversations grew more personal. We talked about life and forgiveness and the strange ways fate brings people back together. He shared that he had once lost his wife to illness and that he had never found peace. Since I told him that peace is not something you find, it is something you build one small act at a time. Before long, we became friends. We would walk by the river after work and talk about the old days, the future, and what it means to start over. There was a calmness in him that made me feel safe again, something I had not felt for a long time. One evening after an event where I spoke about second chances, he came to me holding a small box. He said, "You gave so many people their second chance, Sarah. Maybe it is time you take yours too." I opened the box, and inside was a small silver pendant shaped like an open door. I looked at him surprised, and he said, "It is not a ring, just a reminder that your story is not finished yet." I wore that pendant every day after that, not as a promise, but as hope. Hope that life could still surprise me. Months passed and the foundation flourished. We opened 2 new branches, one in Chicago and another in Dallas. Each time we launched a new one, I would tell the women the same words I once whispered to myself: "You are stronger than what tried to break you." Then one morning I received an invitation from the state governor to attend an award ceremony. They were honoring individuals who had made significant contributions to justice reform. I laughed, thinking it must be some mistake. But when I arrived, I saw my name written right there, Sarah Thompson, advocate for change. My heart pounded as I walked to the stage. I remembered the first time I stood in that same courthouse years ago, shackled and silent. Now I stood there free and proud. As I accepted the award, I looked out at the crowd and spotted Judge Hensley sitting in the front row. He smiled and nodded with quiet pride. I also saw Michael near the back, camera in hand, capturing the moment. My eyes watered, but I held steady. I spoke softly into the microphone. I once stood in this same building feeling small and forgotten, but today I stand here for every woman who thought her voice did not matter. You matter, you always did. The audience stood and clapped, but I only saw one face in the crowd, the face of my mother in my mind, smiling, proud as ever. I whispered inside my heart, "This one is for you, Mama." After the ceremony, Michael and I walked outside. He looked at me and said, "You know, Sarah, if anyone ever told me that a woman once imprisoned would one day change so many lives, I would have said, that sounds like fiction." I smiled and replied, "Life writes the best stories, Michael. We just have to survive long enough to read them." That night, as I drove home, I rolled down the window and let the cool air brush my face. The pendant around my neck shimmered in the moonlight, and I thought about everything: the pain, the loss, the forgiveness, the love. It all had meaning. It all had led me here. When I reached home, I sat by the window, opened Mia's journal one last time, and wrote beneath her final line, "Thank you for teaching me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep living anyway." I closed the book, smiled, and whispered, "Ere to the night I am free, truly free." Years passed and seasons changed, yet the work never slowed down each morning. I woke up before the sun, made my tea, and sat by the window with Mia's old journal beside me. It had become a quiet ritual, something that reminded me of where I started and how far I had come. The foundation had grown beyond anything I ever imagined. There were centers across the country now, each one filled with women who had turned their pain into purpose. They called it the Second Light Project, a name that always made me smile because that was what we all were, second lights shining after the dark. I still worked part-time, mostly helping to train the younger staff, but truthfully, my heart had started to tire. My hands trembled sometimes, and the stares felt longer than before. Michael had retired from journalism, and he often came by with groceries. And that same warm smile that made me feel safe, he would tease me, saying, "You have built an empire of hope, Miss Sarah," and I would laugh, saying, "It is not an empire, Michael, it is a family." One evening he brought me to the river where we used to walk. He said he had something to show me there. On the small bridge was a brass plaque. Newly placed, it read in honor of Sarah Thompson, who believed in broken wings and helped them fly again. I stared at it quietly, and tears filled my eyes. I whispered softly, "You didn't have to do this," and he said, "I did, because people like you don't come twice in a lifetime." That night when I got home, I sat with the pendant around my neck and held it tightly. I thought about my mother, about the courtroom, about the letter from the judge, about Tasha Laila, and all the women whose stories had crossed my life, had been cruel to me once, but it had also been kind. It had given me a second chance to write my own ending. A few months later, my health began to fade. I did not fight it. I had lived enough and loved enough. One morning, as the sun rose, I wrote a letter to the women of the foundation. I told them not to mourn me, but to keep building, keep believing, keep forgiving. I told them that courage was not something you are born with. It is something you grow through kindness and pain. When I passed quietly in my sleep, they said the sunrise that morning was brighter than usual, as if the sky itself was saying goodbye. The women held a memorial for me at the courthouse, the same place where my life had once fallen apart and begun again. The judge's old chair still stood there, polished and empty. My portrait hung on the wall now with a small brass plate that said, "Sarah Thompson, Advocate of Light." Tasha stood at the podium, her voice trembling but strong. She said, "Miss Sarah taught me that every person deserves a chance to be seen as more than their mistakes, and I will keep her promise alive." She then announced a new scholarship in my name for women rebuilding their lives after prison. The crowd clapped softly, and a few tears fell. Michael sat in the front row, clutching the silver pendant I used to wear. He smiled through his tears and whispered, "Thank you, Sarah. You taught me how to live again too." Years later, long after my time, young women would still gather at that same courthouse once a year to share their stories. They would sit on the steps at sunset holding candles and tell how one woman's fight for dignity had changed their path. They never met me, but they knew my story. They called it the woman who faced the judge twice, one time as a prisoner and one time as hope itself. Sometimes I imagine if I could look down from wherever we go after this life, I'd see them laughing, helping one another, finding their second lights, and I'd smile because that was the dream, not fame, not forgiveness, just light. And maybe that is what it means to truly win, not to erase the past, but to build something beautiful from its ashes. So if anyone ever asks who I was, tell them this. I was a woman who once stood in chains and learned how to turn them into wings. I was a woman who forgave, not because they deserved it, but because I did. I was Sarah Thompson, and I believed in broken wings. And as the years go by and the sun keeps rising over the courthouse and the river, I hope my voice still lingers somewhere in the wind, whispering to anyone who feels small and lost, you are stronger than you think, you are loved more than you know, and no matter how dark it gets, there is always another dawn waiting. That was my truth, my story, and my second light, the end.